poked at the Democrats, mocking the Green New Deal, suggesting that it's something that will help Republicans win come 2020. He seemed to try and politically damage Democrats by lumping them together as far-left socialist, all following the lead of figures like Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's a point we heard Vice President Mike Pence try to make during his CPAC address on Friday. President Trump's speech was one of his longest. He spoke for roughly 2 hours, and the president did not stay on script for long. In what seemed to be off-the-cuff remarks, the president slammed the special counsel investigation, attacking special counsel Robert Mueller, and lawmakers now questioning some of his business dealings.
Everybody's having a good time. I'm laughing. We're all having fun. And then that fake CNN and others say, he asked Russia to go get the emails. Horrible. I saw a little shifty Schiff yesterday. No, it's the first time. He went into a meeting and he said, we're going to look into his finance. I said, where did that come from? He always talked about Russia. Collusion with Russia. The collusion delusion. And all of a sudden, they're trying to take you out with okay?
The president also talked about the Hanoi summit, even though talks ended early without a deal. President Trump says that he and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un had productive meetings and that progress was made. He also seemed to address controversial remarks related to the death of an American student who spent 17 months imprisoned in North Korea. In Vietnam, the president told reporters he took Kim Jong-un at his word when he said that he did not know about the mistreatment of Otto Warmbier. Today, President Trump said this.
Otto Warmbier, whose parents I've gotten to know, who's incredible. And I'm in such a horrible position because in one way, I have to negotiate. In the other way, I love Mr. and Mrs. Warmbier, and I love Otto. And it's a very, very delicate balance. He was a special young man. And
the president's initial comments were heavily criticized. The parents of Otto Warmbier released a statement saying that they hold Kim Jong-un and his, in their words, evil regime responsible for their son's death. John?
Ellison Barber at the White House. Thank you. Meanwhile, one of President Trump's potential 2020 rivals kicked off his presidential campaign today. Senator Bernie Sanders hosted a rally this afternoon in Brooklyn, New York, while some other Democrat candidates have been hesitant to criticize President Trump by name. Sanders took direct aim.
Donald Trump wants to divide us up based on the color of our skin, based on where we were born, based on our gender, based on our religion or our sexual orientation. What we are about is doing exactly the opposite.
Jackie Heinrich is live from Brooklyn with more. Jackie.
Well, John, Senator Sanders departed from his usual policy-driven speeches and instead talked about his upbringing, hoping it would not just make him more relatable, but also paint him in stark contrast to President Trump. He talked about growing up lower middle class, the son of a Jewish immigrant who fled Poland because of anti-Semitism.
Underlying principles of our government will not be greed, hatred, and lies. It will not be racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, and religious bigotry.
The Democratic Socialists took a number of swipes at the president, who he characterized as a billionaire who grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth, now dividing America. But in terms of policy, we heard him double down on the same progressive agenda we heard in 2016. He still wants free public college for families who make less than $125,000 a year, Medicare for all, income equality, and a $15 minimum wage, and climate change. But a challenge, he says, will be reminding people that he was the first to bring a lot of these ideas to the table. This week, he said his competition has started to run on ideas that he's championed for a long time. But he hopes to set himself apart by establishing the largest grassroots coalition in American history. He wants to rally 1 million volunteers nationwide and get representation from every state and eventually pull in wins beyond the battleground states.
This is going to be a 50 campaign. We're not going to concede one state to Donald Trump.
The Vermont senator, remember, he broke records, raising $6 million in just the first 24 hours of his campaign. And today, a lot of that same energy drew out thousands here in Brooklyn, despite the cold and even the snow. John.
Jackie Heinrich reporting live. Thanks. So as special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russia seems to wind toward its end, one big question remains. How much of the report will the public see? This as House Democrats ramp up investigations into President Trump ahead of Michael Cohen's return to Capitol Hill next week to testify again. Republican Congressman Mark Green giving his thoughts on the Democrats' endgame.
Oh, it's absolutely going towards impeachment. I mean, these guys they hate Donald Trump, and they're going to do everything they can to try to take him out. The best witness they've got is Michael Cohen, a guy who lied multiple times to the IRS, lied on financial documents, lied to Congress, and he's the witness to Congress. It's pretty ridiculous.
Garrett Tenney is in Washington now with more. Garrett.
Well, John, from the White House to Capitol Hill, folks in D.C. are bracing for the Mueller report. As you mentioned, it's not clear how much of the report will be made public, and there is bipartisan support for that. But the Attorney General will be the one who ultimately makes that decision. Some Republicans, though, are already suggesting the report will be anticlimactic, while others are suggesting it shouldn't be trusted because of the Democratic ties held by some of the Mueller team. And today at CPAC, President Trump once again described the investigation as a witch hunt that never should have been allowed to take place.
Robert Mueller never received a vote, and neither did the person that appointed him. And as you know, the Attorney General says, I'm going to recuse myself. And I said, why the hell didn't he tell me that before I put him in? Robert Mueller put 13 of the angriest Democrats in the history of our country on the commission. Now, how do you do that?
Democrats, meanwhile, are preparing to launch a number of investigations into President Trump, his campaign, his business dealings, as well as his tax returns, as part of what they say is their responsibility to provide oversight as well as checks and balances on the executive branch. Republicans argue it's a hunt for anything to try and take down the president.
They're using these documents that they're getting because now what they're going to target is they're going to target all of Trump's businesses. And that's what this all is about. Get as many documents as you can. Say that you have these secret documents that nobody's seen before, and then there'll be this new supposed crime that Trump at some point.
The president's former attorney, Michael Cohen, will be back on Capitol Hill this week for another round of testimony behind closed doors with the House Intelligence Committee. But this is really just the beginning. Democrats say they plan to bring in other Trump associates to testify, possibly including members of the president's family. John?
All right, Garrett Tenney. Garrett, thank you. As Kim Jong-un returns home to North Korea from Vietnam, the White House is trying to pick up the pieces after President Trump's summit with the North Korean leader ended abruptly without an agreement on denuclearization between the two nations. Jillian Turner has the latest from Washington.
President Trump's team is circling the wagons on North Korea, insisting all's not lost after a week that saw negotiations collapse without warning. Now they're making the case for more future summitry with Kim Jong-un.
We are anxious to get back to the table so we can continue that conversation.
As the president said, it was a productive 2 days, and discussions among teams will continue.
You have to walk away from a bad deal in order to get a much better deal down the road.
Despite the summit's abrupt end, President Trump insisted his interactions with Kim had all been, quote, friendly, and even referred to the dictator responsible for the murder of hundreds of Americans, quote, as my friend, in a tweet earlier in the week. But despite President Trump's personal rosy outlook, the future of the U.S.-North Korea bilateral relationship and nuclear negotiations is far from clear. The two sides left Vietnam with very different takes on why talks broke down. The North Koreans insist they never demanded the full removal of sanctions, as the Trump team claimed they did. In Washington, meanwhile, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle offered some support for President Trump's decision to cut bait, but they weren't happy with his public comments that seemed to absolve Kim of responsibility for Otto Warmbier's death last year.
That'd be a lie. Kim Jong lied. I mean, he had to know. Nothing happens in that country without him knowing.
Just simply because the president says he believes him publicly, that doesn't mean that he's not going to verify everything that North Korea suggests in the future.
Since the summit's end, North Korean officials have said they won't resume ballistic missile testing. But they also cautioned that Kim has, quote, lost some of his desire to negotiate with the United States. Despite these mixed messages from Kim's regime, the Pentagon has gone ahead and canceled 2 large-scale joint exercises with South Korea. John?
Jillian Turner reporting. Thank you. The Trump administration is imposing new sanctions on Venezuela in the growing push to oust disputed President Nicolas Maduro. This as more military members defect from the country in favor of opposition leader Juan Guaido. Steve Harrigan has the latest from Caracas, Venezuela.
John, those new sanctions from the U.S. Treasury Department target individuals inside Venezuela. 6 security chiefs who the U.S. say were responsible for blocking desperately needed humanitarian aid trying to come in from the Colombian border last week. They're also revoking the visas of 49 Venezuelans, diplomats and their families, some of them right now in the U.S. The sanctions have hit hard. They've hit this Maduro government hard, especially the oil sanctions. That's a key source of revenue for the government of Nicolas Maduro, and oil exports have dropped by 40% in just the past month alone. Here's the U.S. Special Envoy to Venezuela.
Maduro supporters that abuse or violate human rights, steal from the Venezuelan people, or undermine Venezuela's democracy are not welcome in the United States.
The opposition leader, Juan Guaido, has been traveling around South America. He's the man the U.S. and 50 other nations now recognize as the president of Venezuela. He was in Ecuador today. He says he's going to come back to Venezuela by Monday, despite the fact of real risk, personal risk, and risk of imprisonment. He says he will begin taking out the role of president, executing his duties immediately. John, back to you.
Steve Harrigan, live from Caracas. Thank you. Kurdish fighters in Syria are reporting heavy battles in the push to root ISIS out of all of its territory. They say the terror group is using snipers and booby traps to defend the last bit of territory under its control. New video shows U.S.-backed forces firing their weapons while smoke rises from a village near the Iraqi border. The operation to liberate that area began in September. Winter weather alerts throughout the country as snow falls from the west to the east coast, creating dangers on the road. Your forecast is coming up, plus this.
Justice delayed is justice denied. I've said that numerous times. Transparency without accountability means nothing. We've seen this time and time again.
2 California police officers who shot and killed an unarmed black man learn whether they will face charges. We'll tell you what prosecutors had to say next. No charges in a deadly police shooting of an unarmed black man in Sacramento. Stephon Clark was shot and killed by 2 officers last year after he ran from them into his grandparents' backyard. The Sacramento County District Attorney says those officers did not break any laws. Marianne Rafferty is in Los Angeles with more. Marianne?
Well, hi, John. Sacramento District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert laid everything out in painstaking detail of the events leading up to and following that shooting that took place almost a year ago. The question was, did the officers who shot and killed Stephon Clark have valid reason for using force? In this case, it was determined they did, but it was a decision that was not taken lightly, especially when grieving family is involved.
I talked to her this morning. She's very upset. That's what I would say. I don't want to go into the details of it, but she's very upset, obviously. I mean, this is her child. This is her child, and nobody can take away from that. No one finds glory in today at all. It's sad. No human being should be in this position.
Leading up to today's decision, the city of Sacramento was bracing for possible fallout in the form of protests across the region. Lawmakers warned to avoid the state capitol and legislative buildings. Also, store owners in downtown Sacramento advised by one local business coalition to take precautions. They were told to be patient and have a plan to protect themselves. Now let's go back to the night 22-year-old Clark was shot. You're watching police body cam video of the actual chase. He wound up in his grandmother's backyard on March 18th of last year after officers responded to a report of someone smashing car windows. Police say they thought Clark had a gun pointed at them, and video the DA's office replayed today shows Clark advancing toward them even after they asked him to show his hands. It turns out Clark, though, is actually holding an iPhone, but the DA's office said there's no way those officers could have known that. Protests have ensued shortly after he was killed, and they've continued leading up to today's announcement. More protests expected as Black Lives Matter has called for demonstrations. Now, Clark's family has filed a $20 million lawsuit against the city of Sacramento, and we should be hearing from them sometime soon. John?
Marianne Rafferty, live from Los Angeles. Thank you. Well, strike no more as teachers in Oakland, California reach a contract deal with district officials Friday, ending a week-long walkout. The Oakland Education Association says the agreement calls for an 11% salary increase and a one-time 3% bonus. It also requires the district to reduce class sizes and hire more student support staff. The walkout affected 36,000 students. March is certainly coming in like a lion this year. Millions of people are under winter weather alerts as disruptive storms wreak havoc all across the country. Adam Klotz is tracking the storms from the Fox Extreme Weather Center. Adam.
Hey there, John. All these storms have been firing up across portions of California. That's happening once again, and we're going to see another line of big weather moving across the country before the weekend's over, getting really into early next week also. This is the current system we're paying attention to, and it has been so soggy all throughout February there in the state of California. That continues here in early March, and we're seeing this system move into the southwest. That is going to sweep across the southern portion of the country. Where it hits the cold air, there's going to be snow, there's going to be ice, and there's going to be a lot of rain with this one also, maybe some big storms across the southeast tomorrow. Here's your future radar, and you can pay attention to the timestamp behind me. So as we head through the overnight hours, this moves across the plains. Everything in the northern portions there is snow. By the time we sweep through our Sunday, it becomes a big storm across the southeast. So everything stretching across the southeast tomorrow afternoon as this storm moves through. There's likely going to be some severe thunderstorms with this, some hail, some strong winds. And then if you live farther north, and there's your dividing line, that's where this becomes a snow system. I do think the mid-Atlantic and then stretching up to New England, this is snow for those folks. Really becoming an issue late Sunday night across New York up towards Boston into early Monday morning before eventually by Monday afternoon this entire system is cleared on out. But on its way out, it brought with it, I think, at least some, at times, heavy snow in some of these locations. So again, all rain across the southeast. If you live up in this corridor, that is where it becomes snow. Now, this system, John, still all the way out in California or just moving off the coast. So there's still a little bit of wiggle room with these systems as we're talking about it moving across the entire country and you get into Monday morning. But some suggestions are Boston 3 to 4 inches, maybe as much as 6 inches as you get up into Portland, Maine. Here in New York City, just a couple inches of snow, and then there are going to be isolated areas probably getting up close to half a foot of total precipitation. But this is the next big one that's going to affect a lot of people across the entire country.
All right, Adam Klotz, we'll be watching. Thank you. It's being called the most serious escalation yet in the growing standoff between India and Pakistan. Why the international community is taking notice. Plus this.
Because we are on the brink of not just winning an election, but transforming our country.
Two competing visions for America as President Trump and Senator Bernie Sanders try to rev up their bases for the 2020 election.
We know that the future does not belong to those who believe in socialism. America will never be a socialist country. Our movement and our future, what we did in 2016, the election we call it with a capital E, it's never been done before, and we're going to do it, I think, again in 2020, and the numbers are going to be even bigger.
President Trump wraps up a whirlwind week with a 2-hour address at CPAC. I'm John Scott, and this is the Fox Report. We're nearing the bottom of the hour, and if you're just joining us, the president's speech touched on a multitude of topics. He called for immigration reform, slammed the Green New Deal, and said Democrats are sick for pushing to investigate his finances. Let's bring in John Bussey, associate editor for the Wall Street Journal and a Fox News contributor. You know, when this president was elected, a lot of conservatives were pretty leery of him, but he got a pretty big welcome at the Conservative Political Action Conference.
He sure did. This is his crowd. They loved him. They applauded throughout and cheered him throughout. It was a great day for him. It was like a rally, one of his rallies.
Which explains the 2-hour speech.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you needed to double up on the coffee to kind of sort of make it through this, because it was, over 2 hours. And look, it had something for everybody. There wasn't a lot of news in it. I mean, there wasn't news in it. There wasn't anything that he said new that kind of broke news, but there was something for everybody. If you liked the president, he hit the high points. It was like a campaign rally. He talked about his successes, his achievements as he saw them. He attacked his critics inside and outside the party. He kind of hit the touchstones for his base. If you don't like the president, there was something for you too. He hit the high points of what he saw was his administration's success, and which one might disagree with. He was mean-spirited at times, self-aggrandizing at others. It was something for everybody in that speech, and it framed the 2020 election.
Yeah, and the framing of that election seems to be wrapping itself around the question of socialism. Let me play part of what the president had to say on that point today.
But while we're making great strides, and our country is doing as well and maybe in many ways better than it's ever done before, Democrat lawmakers are now embracing socialism. They want to replace individual rights with total government domination.
And it is true. I mean, generally, when you're campaigning for a primary in both parties, you run far to one side or the other, and then you kind of come back to the middle for the general election.
Yeah.
But the Democrats who are getting most of the headlines have really embraced socialistic kind of programs.
Yeah, well, there's progressives, and the Bernie Sanders, team is kind of, running with that. And the president's wrong, to say that all Democrats are socialists and they want government to replace. That's just kind of nonsense, but it's good politics, right? He wants to push the Democrats as far to the left to scare those in the middle into voting for him. But the big question is, once you do that, he's kind of on one side of the spectrum and Bernie Sanders is on the other. Who's going to command the middle, where the bulk of the voters are?
That's where elections are won.
Exactly. And who's going to attract that voter who in 2018, changed the landscape? A lot of suburban women came out and voted. A lot of Republicans turned places like Orange County blue. Those are kind of centrists. They're right of center. They're left of center. They may be fiscal conservatives, but social liberals. That's where the vast bulk of the voters in the United States reside. What candidate is going to appeal to them?
Yeah, well, the people like Sherrod Brown of Ohio, he hopes that he can appeal to sort of the working class Democrat. It's expected that he's going to be announcing anyway now.
Biden's another who might sort of, again, reside in that center zone.
John Hickenlooper, former governor of my home state of Colorado, he's talking like he may be jumping into the race. But those are not the guys who are getting the headlines right now.
Yeah, right now they're not. And I think that President Trump is, playing politics, and he does it well, right? He wants to kind of highlight the Democrats who kind of are on the further left part of the party to distinguish himself from them and to make it sound like all Democrats are speaking kind of with the progressive voice. There's a lot of people who do support the progressive side of the Democratic Party. But again, if you're going after a win in the general election, you're going to have to kind of steer toward the middle ground. And that hasn't happened yet in the political rhetoric we've heard.
Well, Bernie Sanders is back in the race in a big way. He raised a lot of money last time, surprised a lot of people in coming in, second to Hillary Clinton. He's back in it, and this is why he says he's running. Listen.
The struggle that we are undertaking is not just about defeating Donald Trump. This struggle is about taking on the incredibly powerful institutions that control the economic and political life of our nation.
And he went on to talk about Wall Street and the big pharmaceutical companies and the big banks and things like that. That's where he says the power resides, and he wants to, shift that power structure. What do you think about his prospects this time around?
Yeah, and that's great fodder for President Trump. Because Bernie Sanders does demark a pretty left part of the Progressive Party. he is running at the top of the, near the top, 1 or 2 or 3, depending upon the poll you look at. Biden is up there, O'Rourke is up there as well, in the polls at this point. But we're so early in the process, and this is not a field that has fully revealed itself yet, and it's not a voter that has fully revealed themselves either. 2018 was a lesson. There was a lot of switchover, and there was a lot of coming out of groups of constituents who stayed out of the 2016 election. They came out much more vociferously in 2018. That's going to galvanize a middle, and that's going to cause, as you point out, the primaries tend to kind of accentuate the viewpoints. The general election tends to bring people toward the middle.
Yeah, most general elections, as Bill Clinton so ably stated, are about the economy. The economy right now, I mean, we're more than 2 years away, but the economy right now looks pretty solid, and it would seem to be the president's best card to play as he tries to run. So will the Democrats who have come out in favor of the Green New Deal, for instance, the Kamala Harrises and others, are they ultimately going to regret that, do you think, or will that kind of fade away as we get closer to the general election?
Yeah, I mean, on the economy, it's really pretty good, and the job situation in the United States is exceptionally good, and you don't hear the president quite. He's picked that theme up in some of his rallies, but you don't see him kind of hammering away at it as much as he could. It is a very big positive for him going into the election. It has sustained itself over the last many months. The Green New Deal, that'll be embraced by those on the left. It'll be perhaps mentioned and avoided by those who are kind of seeking a centrist path. I'm not sure that that's going to be the Democratic Party's. The Democratic Party is going to look at health care. They're going to look at, in the case of Inslee, climate change. But they're going to come back to what got them those seats in the 2018 election, particularly health care.
John Bussey from the Wall Street Journal. Good to have you here.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Meanwhile, there are growing signs former Vice President Joe Biden could be nearing a decision on 2020. Peter Doocy has more on that.
Joe Biden says he's been given a go for 2020 by his kids and his grandkids.
I have not made the final decision, but don't be surprised.
Biden is best known as Barack Obama's right-hand man and once summed up their biggest legislative win with one of TV's most famous bleeps. For other Democrats already campaigning, Obamacare is old news.
I support Medicare for all.
The longtime lawmaker from Delaware also falls a lot closer to the middle than the Democratic Socialist wing.
Half of older workers have no savings as they face retirement.
Although he might sympathize with that.
I don't own a single stock or bond. Don't hold it. I have no savings account. But I get a great pension and I get a good salary.
If he runs, Biden will also have to address concerns about his support of the tough crime bill that was recently reformed and his leadership of the committee that grilled Clarence Thomas accuser Anita Hill.
I wish I could have done more to prevent those questions.
He'll also be running for the first time since cell phone cameras can capture every blunder, like this one in 2006. Quote, "You cannot go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent." I'm not joking. In 2016, a grief-stricken Biden ruled out a run to process his son Beau's death. Since then, his family's personal lives have been made tabloid news. And New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd writes, quote, "Not all families have to stomach Donald Trump's low blows as Biden will if he runs. And Biden will have to temper that Irish temper of his." That's been tough since Trump took over.
They asked me, would I like to debate this gentleman? And I said, no. I said, if we were in high school, I'd take him behind the gym and beat the hell out of him.
But President Trump welcomes the fight.
Go like this. He's down, and he'll never get up.
Biden tested out his 2020 pitch in dozens of states as a top midterm surrogate in 2018. And polls show that he would be the frontrunner the day he enters the race. But President Obama recently said he thinks the party needs new blood, and that likely doesn't apply to his former VP. In Newark, Delaware, Peter Doocy, Fox News.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau facing what is being described as the biggest political crisis of his career. Trudeau's former Attorney General publicly testifying that the Prime Minister and his senior aides pressured her to end a long-standing corruption case against a firm in Quebec. She accuses Trudeau of interfering with the judicial system, but admits he did not break the law. Trudeau argues he was simply trying to save jobs. Deadly border clashes resuming today between India and Pakistan in the disputed region of Kashmir. The violence coming just one day after Pakistan handed over a captured Indian pilot in what it calls a goodwill gesture. Kitty Logan is live in London with the latest.
Hi, John. So there's been renewed violence in the border areas of Kashmir, killing at least 6 people. And that's despite an apparent de-escalation when an Indian pilot captured by Pakistan was returned home on Friday. Indian and Pakistani troops targeted villages either side of the Kashmir line of control. 3 local residents on the Indian side died when a shell hit their home. Civilians were also caught in the crossfire on Pakistani territory. Pakistani authorities have accused India of targeting residential areas indiscriminately. But both sides blame each other for this latest violence. It's the most serious escalation over the disputed territory of Kashmir in decades and breaches a ceasefire agreement dating back to 2003. And there is international concern as both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. Both sides stepped back from the brink on Friday when an Indian pilot who'd been detained by the Pakistan military was allowed to return home to India. The Indian government called this a gesture of peace. The pilot appears unharmed and is now being checked up in hospital. His plane was shot down as India carried out airstrikes over Pakistan last Tuesday. The Indian government says it was targeting militants in Pakistani Kashmir who it claims were responsible for a suicide bombing on the Indian-controlled side 2 weeks ago, which killed 40 people. Pakistan denies harbouring the militants on its territory. Of course, India and Pakistan have disputed the sovereignty of Kashmir for decades. And while there's no hope in sight of resolving that dispute, there is perhaps a chance that both sides might go back to sticking to that original ceasefire deal. John?
Kitty Logan from London. Thank you. Nearly 5 months after Hurricane Michael ravages the Florida Panhandle, one coastal community is still facing a monumental challenge in its efforts to recover. Officially ending spring large-scale military drills that it usually holds with South Korea. 2 defense officials told Fox News yesterday the cancellation is due to a decreased threat from North Korea following 2 Trump-Kim summits. The Pentagon says this decision reflected its desire to reduce tensions and support diplomatic efforts, also to achieve complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Nearly 5 months after Hurricane Michael ravaged Mexico Beach, Florida, residents there are still trying to rebuild their lives, but help could finally be on the way from Congress. Ali Rafa has that story.
Mexico Beach is still unrecognizable to Mayor Al Kathy.
I still don't remember whose house or how big it was.
4 months after Hurricane Michael, Kathy describes the once picturesque town as a humble slice of paradise.
And then Michael came on October 10th, and our world changed.
The Category 4 hurricane plowing down 80% of the town, leaving just 500 of 2,700 homes still standing.
To give you some perspective of that, we have about 330 water customers. That's it.
After losing his business of 45 years, the only hardware store in town, he reopened nearby with what was spared.
That's something Chuck will have to get for you.
One of less than 10 businesses back up and running.
It's sort of a makeshift operation, but it's better than not having any place to go.
Months after Michael, most of Mexico Beach still looks like this. The devastation stripping the community of thousands of jobs that once ran the town's tourism-driven economy.
The longer it goes, you can think back and it gets emotional. You can't get gas. You can't do anything.
The National Weather Service estimates over $30 billion in losses in the Sunshine State alone, something the Panhandle-based St. Joe Company wants to reverse with an ambitious agenda.
We've accelerated a lot of our projects specifically related to hurricane relief and recovery,
which includes breaking ground on a 200-acre retail and residential village in Mexico Beach within the next year.
We're hopeful to cater to the businesses that were in Mexico Beach, so we would have facilities for them to start their businesses again.
A plan Kathy welcomes with open arms.
This is a marathon we're in. We haven't even run a mile yet.
A bipartisan group of senators introduced a nearly $14 billion relief package Tuesday for states affected by last year's natural disasters, drawing support from President Trump, who's encouraging Congress to pass the legislation. In Mexico Beach, Florida, Ali Rafa, Fox News.
Also in Florida, SpaceX launches a rocket into orbit with a special mission in mind, how it could change space exploration for the U.S. in the future. A live report next.
Like a rocket.